the shadow of corruption. The courtroom was bathed in an eerie glow that betrayed an undercurrent of sinister intent. Judge Malcolm Price, a man both revered and reviled, presided over the case with an air of absolute authority. For years, Price had developed a reputation as the judge who skillfully manipulated the scales of justice. With subtle nods to influential lobbyists and discreet hush money, he routinely let dangerous criminals slip through the grasp of the law. His gavel, when it finally struck, carried the weight of corruption more than it carried truth. On this fateful day, Price's verdict resonated like a death knell. Case dismissed. The defendant, a notorious gang leader whose criminal exploits had made headlines, offered a smirk of defiance as he was escorted out by a stoic bailiff. In the gallery, murmurs of discontent began to ripple among the spectators. Ordinary citizens, victims of the very system Price controlled, exchanged looks of sorrow and anger, but their voices were quickly silenced by the overwhelming aura of power that the judge exuded. Back in his richly appointed chambers, surrounded by dark wood paneling and portraits of long-deceased legal luminaries, Price allowed himself a moment of self-congratulation. Seated behind an imposing desk with a glass of aged scotch in hand, he reflected on the day's proceedings. In his eyes, justice was a game he had mastered by bending the rules to his favor. Yet, as he swirled the amber liquid in his glass, a flicker of unease stirred within him, a sensation that whispered of impending reckoning. Later that evening, Price attended a lavish dinner at a grand private club frequented by the city's elite. The room was filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the soft strains of a live piano. Despite the convivial atmosphere, the conversation was laced with subtle insinuations. Whispers of his leniency and the mounting evidence of corruption permeated the air. Some guests cast furtive glances his way whenever his name was mentioned. Price, ever the confident manipulator, dismissed these murmurs with a casual smile, confident in the fortress of his reputation. Yet, deep down, he couldn't shake the disquiet, a premonition that his carefully constructed empire was under threat. As the night wore on and the dinner came to an end, the city outside grew dark and misty. The elite departed in sleek vehicles, and Price returned to his mansion, a sprawling estate that stood as a testament to his power and influence. His mind, however, was still troubled by the day's events and the silent voices of dissent that seemed to echo in the corridors of his memory. At the stroke of midnight, when the world was cloaked in darkness, a black car rolled quietly up the long driveway. The vehicle's presence was unremarkable, yet its timing was not. A solitary, cloaked figure emerged from the car and moved deliberately toward the mansion. The figure was an enigma, a person shrouded in mystery whose footsteps were silent and whose intentions were unknown. Inside, Price settled into the privacy of his study, a room filled with ancient law books, personal mementos, and reminders of a time when justice was served without corruption. The soft hum of the air conditioner and the distant sounds of the night provided a deceptive calm. Then, without warning, the tranquility was shattered by the abrupt crash of breaking glass. Price startled upright, his heart pounding as he scanned the room for the source of the disturbance. Before he could process the danger, a shadowy figure emerged from the darkness at the far end of the study. The intruder's gloved hand reached out with calculated precision, and for a moment, the judge's sense of control wavered. In a voice distorted by a modulator, the figure spoke. "Judge Price, you have taken too many lives by letting criminals roam free. Tonight, justice will be served." The words hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Price's mind raced as he tried to comprehend whether this was an elaborate hoax or a very real threat. The intruder's silhouette moved with the certainty of someone who had been waiting for this moment, a moment when the veneer of untouchability would finally crack. As the figure stepped closer, a small device was produced, its screen flashing images of faces. Victims of the criminal's price had let escape. The device displayed names and dates in rapid succession, each one a silent indictment of the judge's corrupt legacy. These, the intruder declared, are the forgotten victims of your negligence. Your corruption has left scars that can never heal. And now you must answer for your sins. With those chilling words, the figure swiftly retreated into the shadows, leaving behind a scene of chaos. Shattered glass littered the floor, scattered papers told the story of broken order, and on the wall, bold red letters were scrawled, "Justice is inevitable." Stunned into silence, Price staggered backward, the weight of his misdeeds crashing down upon him. In that moment, he realized that the system he had so artfully manipulated had turned its gaze upon him. The message was clear: no one was above the consequences of corruption, not even him. For what felt like an eternity, Price stood in the darkness of his study. The red words seared into his mind. Regret, fear, and a dawning realization of vulnerability mingled in his thoughts. The mansion that once represented his power now seemed like a gilded cage, trapping him in the reality of his own making. As the intruder's words echoed in his ears, the judge understood that the night had brought him face to face with his ultimate reckoning. The scales of justice, long skewed in his favor, were beginning to tip inexorably towards retribution. With trembling hands and a heart now heavy with dread, Price sank into a chair, the finality of the red message a grim promise that his days of unchecked authority were numbered. The winds of retribution, the shocking events of that fateful midnight had left an indelible mark on Judge Malcolm Price. The echo of shattering glass and the haunting declaration of justice reverberated in his mind as he tried to regain control of his unraveling world. In the aftermath of the intruder's visit, the once impregnable fortress of his reputation had begun to crumble. Price spent the following hours in a haze of disbelief and paranoia, each ticking minute a reminder that his carefully constructed empire was under siege. As dawn broke, a bleak light seeped through the heavy drapes of his study. Price sat motionless, his mind reeling from the intrusion and the accusatory message splashed in crimson on his wall. His hands trembled as he reached for his glass of scotch, a futile attempt to drown his rising terror. The faces on the device haunted him, the names of those whose lives had been lost due to the criminals he had allowed to walk free. Each name was a silent indictment of his actions, a verdict that no amount of wealth or influence could overturn. Unable to shake the dread, Price summoned his closest confidant, a seasoned attorney named Vivian Cross, known for her discretion and unwavering loyalty. In a hurried phone call that broke the silence of the early morning, he confided in her about the incident. "Vivian, something's terribly wrong," he rasped, his voice laden with anxiety. "Someone came for me last night. They left a message, a threat." Vivian's voice, measured yet urgent, promised that she would handle the matter discreetly. "Malcolm, we need to act quickly," she said. "I'll arrange a meeting with a few trusted allies. We can't let this scandal break loose." In the ensuing hours, Price found himself surrounded by a circle of influential figures who had long benefited from his decisions. Yet, as he walked into a lavish private meeting room in his mansion, a room filled with mahogany furniture and expensive art, he sensed that even these allies now viewed him with a mix of pity and veiled suspicion. The conversation was tense, the usual camaraderie replaced by furtive glances and hesitant words. They discussed the incident in hushed tones, each expressing concern that Price's predicament could expose far more than just his own corruption. It was an unraveling that threatened to dismantle a network of powerful interests. Meanwhile, outside the opulent walls of his mansion, the city buzzed with rumors of a mysterious assault on a high-ranking judge. News outlets, always hungry for scandal, began to pick up on whispers of retribution. Social media erupted with hashtags and speculations, painting Price as either a victim of an elaborate hoax or the architect of a deadly conspiracy. The public, already disillusioned by stories of corruption, found a grim satisfaction in the notion that even the mighty could fall. Within the walls of the legal system, murmurs of dissent and demands for accountability started to gain traction. A determined investigative reporter, known for digging deep into corruption, began to gather evidence of Price's questionable rulings. His work, fueled by public outrage, promised to expose the intricate web of bribery and manipulation that had allowed criminals to escape justice for so long. Though Price was desperate to maintain his grip on power, the noose was slowly tightening around him. Back at his mansion, as dusk approached, Price's inner world was a storm of regret and anxiety. He recalled the opulent dinners and lavish parties of his recent past, where his decisions had been celebrated and his influence unchallenged. Now, those very privileges seemed to have transformed into shackles, binding him to a fate he could no longer evade. In the solitude of his private study, Price confronted the magnitude of his sins. The red message on his wall burned like a scarlet brand, an unyielding promise that justice, in its raw and unfiltered form, was inevitable. In a desperate bid to salvage his legacy, Price initiated a covert investigation into the origins of the threat. He commissioned private security experts and trusted investigators to comb through every detail of the previous night. Every fingerprint, every security camera, and every whisper from the corridors was scrutinized. But the intruder had been meticulous, leaving little behind except the haunting message and shattered glass. Price's frustration grew with every passing moment. He knew that the answer lay hidden within the very system he had corrupted, a system now turning its gaze back upon him. As days turned into nights and the pressure mounted, Price began receiving anonymous communications. Some were veiled warnings, while others were direct demands for accountability. One message, delivered through an untraceable email, read, "Your reign of corruption ends now. Confess or face the consequences." Each message further unhinged Price's once unflappable demeanor. He started to see betrayal in every shadow and treachery in every smile. Even those closest to him seemed to harbor secrets that could unravel his carefully maintained facade. In a final, desperate attempt to regain control, Price convened a secret meeting with the highest echelons of his political and financial allies. In a lavish, dimly lit hotel suite, they gathered to discuss damage control. The air was thick with tension as accusations flew and loyalties were questioned. Price pleaded for unity and solidarity, arguing that his removal from power would trigger a cascade of scandals affecting them all. But the seeds of distrust had already been sown. Despite his impassioned pleas, many expressed concerns that the time had come for a reckoning, one that might spare them if they distanced themselves from the fallen judge. As the meeting drew to a close and the allies dispersed into the night, Price was left alone with the cold realization that his days of unchecked power were numbered. The winds of retribution were gathering force, and no amount of wealth or influence could shield him from the impending downfall. Every decision he had made, every life he had ruined in the name of justice, now came back to haunt him with relentless fury. In that somber silence, as the city outside whispered of revolution and reform, Judge Malcolm Price realized that the era of his dominion had ended. The very foundations of the system he had manipulated were collapsing around him, and the relentless pursuit of truth was poised to expose every dark secret he had so carefully hidden. The message was clear. Corruption, no matter how deeply entrenched, could never escape the vigilant gaze of justice. The unraveling web, In the days following the secret meeting, a palpable sense of dread clung to Judge Malcolm Price like a shroud. The echoes of betrayal from his closest allies reverberated through the corridors of power, leaving him isolated in a fortress of his own making. With every passing hour, the unraveling of his carefully constructed empire accelerated. Price's desperation to reclaim control spurred him into a frenetic search for the origins of the threat that had so boldly shattered his illusions of invincibility. Determined to identify the architect of his impending downfall, Price instructed his remaining loyal aides to comb through every available record, security footage, call logs, and even obscure financial transactions. In his opulent study, illuminated by the harsh glare of a solitary desk lamp, he pored over the evidence with feverish intensity. Every detail was scrutinized, every anomaly noted. But the intruder had been meticulous, leaving behind only fragments. A shard of broken glass, a cryptic message, and the eerie images on a small device. Each clue only deepened the mystery, painting a portrait of a mastermind who had not only anticipated Price's vulnerabilities, but had exploited them ruthlessly. Late one rainy evening, as thunder rumbled in the distance, Price sat alone in his study, his mind a storm of paranoia and regret. It was then that he received a message on a secure, encrypted line, a channel he had rarely used since his reign was at its peak. The message was succinct and chilling. "The web you wove has ensnared you. Find the truth in the shadows, or it will devour you." The words struck him like lightning, electrifying the air around him and sending a shiver down his spine. Price knew that the message was not a mere threat but a summons to confront the dark underbelly of his past misdeeds. Determined to reclaim even a semblance of control, Price ordered an internal investigation. He summoned a team of private investigators, veterans of the underworld who operated in the gray zones of legality, and tasked them with tracing every lead back to its source. These investigators, hardened by years in the clandestine world of corruption and espionage, began weaving together disparate threads of information. They discovered that the threats were not isolated incidents but part of a broader movement fueled by a network of activists and dissidents who had suffered under the weight of Price's biased judgments. In a hidden safe house far from the prying eyes of the media and law enforcement, Price's team gathered evidence of systemic corruption. Dusty ledgers, confidential emails, and covert recordings began to form a damning mosaic that implicated not only Price but a host of influential figures who had colluded with him. The investigators found records of illicit payments, coded messages exchanged between shadowy operatives, and names that had long been buried in the annals of power. Each discovery added to the mounting evidence that Price's empire was built on a foundation of lies and treachery, a foundation that was now crumbling under the weight of its own corruption. As the investigation deepened, the public's interest grew. Rumors of the corrupt judge and the mysterious vigilante spread like wildfire. Underground blogs and independent news sites began publishing anonymous tips and leaked documents, stoking the flames of outrage among an increasingly disillusioned populace. Social media exploded with hashtags calling for accountability, and protesters gathered outside the courthouse demanding justice. The once unassailable Judge Price now found himself ensnared in a maelstrom of public scrutiny and media frenzy. Within the confines of his mansion, Price's personal life unraveled in tandem with his professional downfall. He became reclusive, his once opulent lifestyle reduced to desperate attempts to control the narrative. Late-night phone calls, secret meetings, and frantic consultations with his remaining allies filled his days, but every effort seemed only to tighten the noose around his neck. The anonymous messages continued, each one a harbinger of doom that left him sleepless and haunted. In a moment of raw vulnerability, Price retreated to his private study one final time, staring at the red-inked message on his wall. The phrase "justice is inevitable" burned into his consciousness as he contemplated the irreversible consequences of his actions. His mind wandered back to the faces of those he had wronged, the countless lives derailed by his lenient rulings. With a bitter mix of defiance and resignation, he realized that the web of retribution was not merely external. It was woven into his very soul. The man he had become was inextricably linked to the ruin he now faced. Even as the storm raged outside, Price's internal tempest raged louder. Every shadow in his mansion seemed to whisper accusations, every creak in the floor a reminder of his impending fall. His once impenetrable fortress of wealth and influence had transformed into a prison of guilt and paranoia. In that final, desperate moment of introspection, Judge Malcolm Price understood that his fate was sealed. The forces of justice, long suppressed and manipulated, were rising to reclaim balance. The web he had so carelessly spun was now tightening, and there was no escape. As dawn broke the next morning, a grim resolve took hold of Price. With his empire disintegrating and his secrets laid bare, he prepared to face the consequences of his corruption. The pursuit of truth had begun to close in on him, and the haunting promise of retribution was now unavoidable. The stage was set for his ultimate reckoning, a reckoning that would not only expose his sins but also serve as a powerful reminder that no one, no matter how high, is immune to the scales of justice. The reckoning. Dawn broke over the city like a harsh awakening, its light revealing the aftermath of a night filled with retribution and despair. Judge Malcolm Price, once the mighty arbiter of justice, now found himself standing at the precipice of his own ruin. The revelations of the past days had left him exposed, a man whose every secret had been peeled away by the relentless pursuit of truth. In his sprawling mansion, once a sanctuary of power, it now felt as if every room echoed with the voices of those he had wronged. In the early hours of the morning, Price convened an emergency meeting with his remaining loyalists. The tension in the lavish drawing room was palpable. The once confident smiles had faded into expressions of dread and uncertainty. "We must act fast," Price implored, his voice wavering as he tried to rally his dwindling support. But every proposal, every plea for solidarity, was met with silent resignation. The network that had propped him up was crumbling under the weight of mounting evidence and public outrage. Outside, the city was in uproar. News channels, once careful to protect the reputations of the powerful, now broadcast live footage of protesters gathering outside the courthouse. Their chants for justice reverberated through the streets, a cacophony of anger and determination. Social media exploded with the hashtags #JusticeForAll and #PriceMustFall, uniting a populace that had long been disillusioned by corruption. Amid the chaos, an investigative reporter named Marcus Reed, known for his fearless exposés, had uncovered the final pieces of the puzzle. His relentless digging revealed a trail of illicit transactions, covert communications, and hidden alliances, all pointing directly to Price and his circle of corrupt allies. With every revelation, Reed's determination grew, fueling a wave of public sentiment that demanded accountability. In a final bid to salvage his legacy, Price decided to hold a press conference in a bid to address the accusations head-on. The venue was a grand auditorium, filled to capacity with journalists, activists, and curious onlookers. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, a collective breath held in the knowledge that history was about to be written. As Price stepped onto the stage, the murmur of the crowd swelled into a roar. His face, once a mask of unwavering authority, now betrayed signs of fear and desperation. He attempted to regain control, launching into a rehearsed defense of his actions. But every word he uttered seemed hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence. The room buzzed with whispers, and the tension was so thick that it was almost tangible. Then, mid-speech, the doors at the back of the auditorium burst open. A group of law enforcement officers, accompanied by federal agents, stormed in. Among them was Marcus Reed, holding a thick dossier of documents. The lead agent stepped forward and announced, "Judge Malcolm Price, you are under arrest for corruption, obstruction of justice, and a litany of related charges." The declaration was met with stunned silence, punctuated by the sound of camera shutters snapping in rapid succession. Price's eyes widened in disbelief as he was handcuffed and led away. In that moment, the full weight of his misdeeds crashed down upon him. The stage, once his domain, had turned into a spectacle of retribution. The crowd erupted in a mixture of triumph and relief, their voices rising in a unified call for change. The fall of a once powerful figure served as a stark reminder that no one was beyond the reach of justice. Back in his now empty mansion, Price sat alone in his study. The red-inked message, "Justice is inevitable," remained scrawled on the wall, a permanent testament to the consequences of his corruption. As he stared at the words, a sense of resignation washed over him. He knew that his legacy would forever be defined by this moment, a moment when the scales of justice finally tipped in favor of truth. Meanwhile, across the city, the investigation continued to unravel the remaining threads of the vast conspiracy. Marcus Reed's expose would soon make headlines, igniting further reforms within the legal system. Activists, emboldened by the fall of a corrupt institution, organized rallies and campaigns to ensure that such abuses of power would never happen again. The case of Judge Price became a catalyst for change, a beacon of hope for those who believed that true justice, though often delayed, was always attainable. In the quiet aftermath of these seismic events, the narrative of Judge Malcolm Price and the collapse of his empire stood as a powerful reminder. Corruption, no matter how deeply entrenched, is destined to be exposed. The relentless pursuit of truth had triumphed, and the world had witnessed the fall of a man who had long believed himself untouchable. As this saga of betrayal, retribution, and ultimate justice comes to a close, I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to all of you for following this gripping tale. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share this video so that you never miss another journey into the world of suspense and mystery. Your support helps bring more untold stories of corruption and redemption to light. Stay curious and keep seeking the truth.